you for putting up with some time there while I switched browsers and figured out how to get this thing to work. So anyway, I wanted to give you a little bit of an update on global water futures, some of the science that's going on, and some of the projects which may be relevant to the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture Committee and others interested in prairie wetlands. So, and we're still going to there we are. Great. So the one thing, stepping back as to why we established the Global Water Futures Program and what were the driving factors behind it. One is that the commonality of water is an essential part of our life, our society, and our environment. And whether it's drinking water or water for food or water for energy, water for our communities, water for our ecosystems and the services that they provide, it's incredibly important, and it's a unifying factor amongst Canadians. But there's the other side of water as well, and these are the risks associated with it. And we've seen ourselves in Canada as the water fortunate country for many years because of the tremendous water resources we have per capita and the vast and splendid natural environment that we have. But things are changing, and in the last few years in particular, we've had unprecedented numbers of floods in our cities and the prairies and the mountains, problems with our lakes due to contamination, harmful algal blooms, not only in Lake Erie, but in Western Canada, of course, and drought, which has reared its head again recently. We're also warming up faster than many other parts of the world, and northwestern parts of Canada have had 6.5 degrees of warming for winter minimum temperatures since the early 1960s. The shifts in temperature and associated shifts in precipitation have caused rainfall flooding in the prairies in 2014, a rather unprecedented event over the regions where it occurred. Extraordinary wildfires over the last few years in British Columbia, Fort McMurray, the year before that in Saskatchewan and in the north. Deglaciation to the point where it's changing the directions of rivers and the shapes of watersheds in the Yukon, and permafrost thaw in the discontinuous and continuous zone, and permafrost disappearance and landscape collapse in the discontinuous zone. So we're doing this at a time, so we're undergoing rapid climate change at a time when our cities and our industries, our agriculture are developing and intensifying. And this creates some challenges for us. So the Global Water Futures Program was proposed in 2016 and funded by the Canada First Research Excellence Fund. And it aims, or two aims to it. One is to place Canada as a global leader in water science for cold regions, and we hope some other aspects of water science as well, including how to look at it in an integrated way at some of the water problems, and also how to bring in Indigenous communities into water solutions. The second is to address the strategic needs of the Canadian economy. The Canada First Research Excellence Fund was very keen that we do that. And basically, we'll be doing this by showing how we might adapt to change and manage risks of uncertain water futures and extreme events in the future. There are three parts to our mission that we've selected, and the first one is to improve disaster warning. Many of the floods and fires in Canada, we felt that our responses would be improved with greater warning of what might occur, and the consequences of that, whether they be water quality episodes, quantity episodes, or other climate impacts. And this means that we need to improve our understanding of water-based disasters, our ability to monitor them, and our ability to model them and predict them. We also want to help support a national forecasting capacity to better predict the risk and severity of extreme events, such as floods, droughts, water quality episodes. Then there's a longer-term aspect as well, where we wish to predict water futures for, say, 2050 and 2100, to use the models, the data that we've assembled to better support decision-making, and to develop improved models that can assess changes in the human natural land systems on our watersheds. And so this is a very important part of what we're doing. And then finally, we want to help users by informing their adaptation to change and risk management. We want to help them reduce the risk of water threats, develop adaptive strategies, enhance their economic opportunities. Excuse me. We structure Global Water Futures around 3 science pillars. One, a little bit more sciencey, diagnosing and predicting change in cold regions. The second, a bit more technological. This is developing the big data and decision support systems, essentially observations and monitoring. And the third is working with users to design solutions for their problems. A main aspect of Global Water Futures is a national observation and prediction strategy. We have substantial core teams which will help us deliver a national modeling capacity, and supported by advanced computer science, observational science, and knowledge mobilization. We have a variety of user-led projects that support this as well. And so if you look at the numbers on these teams, 32 for the modeling team, 9 for computer science, 4 for data management, 20 technicians, 3 for knowledge mobilization, 9 for communications. This is a substantial improvement in an addition, an enhancement to our national capacity in these areas. In fact, as a modeling and information group for water science, it's the largest team ever assembled in Canada. We have good reason to do this. When we look at Western Canada, the Earth system change that has occurred in the area is deeply disturbing. Pervasive warming across the region, but also changes in precipitation, changes in permafrost glaciers, snow-covered periods, summer flooding, changes in flow. And the hydrological responses of these have been very complex. However, some of the most dramatic hydrological responses are in the prairie provinces associated with wetland drainage basins. One case study that we've been observing intensely recently is Smith Creek Research Basin near Langenburg in eastern Saskatchewan, and this flows into the Assiniboine River Basin. You see there, and it's it's been documented to have undergone fairly rapid drainage since the late 1950s. The drainage channel length has increased approximately 8-fold within the last up into the last few years. And the depressions, these depressions can form wetlands or simply ponds or lakes. So it's a combination of all of these. That area is reduced from 24% of the basin to 10%. So more than half of them have been lost over time since the late 1950s. Now, some of that loss will be due to drainage, and some of that will be due to climate change, as we'll get into. Certainly, the depressional storage drainage has a large impact. Looking at aerial photos of Smith Creek, you see the artificially drained areas compared to areas that are drained after a wet spring, and there's a vast difference in the storage of water in the landscape. What's interesting is looking at the climate of the watershed. The temperature has been increasing quite substantially, but the annual precipitation has not been changing. This is research done by Stacy Domansky of U of S as part of her master's. But the proportion which is rainfall and that proportion which is snowfall has changed. And snowfall used to be 1/3 of the annual precipitation. It's dropped down to 20%. This is important because the spring snowmelt is critical for filling many of the wetlands and depressions in the spring. However, it's being supplemented by a change in rainfall. We're getting more rainfall in spring and in fall, March, May, June, and October. The March and October rains can put an ice layer on top of the frozen ground, which can increase the runoff potential from snowmelt or rain on snow events. And the May-June rainfall, of course, can contribute to runoff because soils tend to be wet and evaporation rates low, particularly in May, in that period. The other shift in rainfall which is occurring is the duration of storms. The duration of single-day storms, usually convective storms, are driven, which occur over very small areas, has not increased, but the multiple-day storms have increased approximately 50% in their number since the 1940s. That's interesting because those multiple-day storms are large frontal events, which can cover large parts of a watershed and coordinate large-scale runoff events in the summertime, which is exactly what we've seen occurring. So when we look at the stream flow hydrograph for Smith Creek, we find some dramatic changes occurring. There was a shift from annual runoff of about 3,000 cubic decameters up until the early 1990s. That essentially tripled after 1995 and then shot up again to a total of 14-fold increase since 2010. So that's a tremendous change in the water export from this watershed. And if we look at the processes that are driving that export, we see that it's changed from a snowmelt-dominated watershed to a rainfall-dominated watershed in time since the 1970s. In fact, it was over 85% snowmelt dominated up until 1994, and that's dropped to less than half of the stream flow now. So there's been an increase in snowmelt, but a massive increase in the rainfall runoff, 150-fold for rainfall, 34-fold for rain on snow. And when we look at the hydrographs of Smith Creek, and this is, we see the hydrographs are almost unrecognizable from what you might have seen in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to what you see now. And where there was a clear snowmelt peak before and the stream used to go dry at the end of May, now we might see much higher peaks and secondary peaks in midsummer, which can even exceed the rainfall peak. So there are big shifts going on in Smith Creek, and part of that is drainage, and part of that is a change in climate. And the combination together is absolutely dynamite. So this is why we need to improve our ability to model impacts such as wetland drainage and climate change across the prairies and across the country. So Global Water Futures has instituted a national modeling strategy, and you see highlighted there the basins that will be our initial focus. And so in the prairies, the Saskatchewan-Nelson Basin and the Peace Athabasca Basin are critical to that. But you see others such as the Great Lakes St. Lawrence, which are pretty big, the Yukon, the Fraser, the Columbia, and the St. John River in eastern Canada. That core team dealing with modeling and forecasting will be focusing on three areas. One is hydrological and water quality model development. The second is climate change and diagnostic applications. And the third is water resources systems. The modeling strategy itself is quite comprehensive. We're driving the whole suite of models through Environment Canada's atmospheric model, the GEM model, which is a numerical weather forecast system. For short-term forecasting purposes, over longer terms, we'll use downscaled regional climate models, dynamically downscaled, quite often using WRF out of the United States. We have a strong collaboration with NCAR in Boulder, Colorado on that. The terrestrial models will involve GEM Hydro, the MESH model, CRIM model, the VIC model, the HYPE model. If you don't know these are all models with a strong physical basis and some cold regions capability. They've had testing in the Prairie provinces and elsewhere in Canada. And HYPE brings in some water quality aspects as well, as does CRIM now, with recent additions of nitrogen, phosphorus to its capabilities. We'll be taking those terrestrial models, assimilating observations into them. We are developing a new modeling strategy called the Canadian Hydrological Model, which will be a coupled hydrological water quality model working with multiple physics representations and at multiple scales. I won't go into that too much here, but that's our glint in the future to do something really novel and interesting. And we'll be integrating water quality modeling with hydrological modeling. When we move into the rivers, we'll deal with floodplains, rivers and lakes, lake quality modeling as well, and river ice, including substantial data simulation. And then finally, water is managed throughout Canada, so we need to incorporate reservoir operations, irrigation, other water impoundments, and couple that to economic modeling. And then we're also developing visualization tools for stakeholder engagement. This will couple to an integrated modeling program for Canada project, but it's also part of the core modeling team for Global Water Futures. And at the large scales, if you look at the Saskatchewan River Basin, it's absolutely critical to include human water use in calculating the hydrograph, and so there's a suite of work done on that, led by Simon Razavi and Howard Wheater. The mesh development itself has been led over the years by Al Pietranero and colleagues. When we want to take these models now and start to look at future change in the 21st century, we have to look at the downscaled regional climate model products. They generally show warming and wetting over Western Canada, but lots of variability and important shifts in things such as the 0-degree isotherm, which gives us that divide between rain and snow, which is so important for controlling our water resources. We also are looking at changes in land cover, agricultural practices, wetland drainage, and natural vegetation as the climate shifts. And then in the upland, in the headwaters of the rivers, changing glaciers, and in the north, changing permafrost. One of the models we've used is the cold regions hydrological model, and modeling that on Smith Creek, we can just take the average flow over several recent years and change the wetland area from what it was in 2008 and get an idea of the sensitivity of the response of the modeled stream flow to changes in depressional area or wetland area. And we see that by increasing the wetland area up to where it was in the 1950s, we can drop the annual flows about 30%. And by draining all of them, we can increase them about 55%. So there's a strong sensitivity in the model to the wetland volume, the storage capacity of those wetlands. And you see feedbacks on the evapotranspiration in various years. And of course, that's the function of the storing water in a depression of wetland, is you're making it available to evaporate at a much faster rate than it would be otherwise within that watershed. So we do see that evaporation instance. We also see changes in routing, and that influences the peak flow. The fill and spill process that wetlands undergo as they fill up and spill to the next involves very inefficient flow over fields through vegetation, whereas the channelized flow through the canals that are often dug to drain wetlands are very efficient and move water off very effectively out of the basin. And so you see that as you decrease wetland area for various years of our simulation, you see an increase in peak discharge that can be quite substantial. And so if we look at the 2011 year, as 60 square kilometers is roughly where it was in 2008, and we're almost doubling that peak discharge through complete wetland drainage, and we can moderate it a little bit by restoring them. So idea of some of the things that we're heading for with the large-scale models across the prairies. As of January 2018, Global Water Futures has funded 33 projects involving over 211 faculty across Canada at 15 universities, and we're in the process of hiring almost 450 graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, scientists, and engineers, technicians, and other research managers. We have over 170 partners involved in the federal, provincial governments, Indigenous governments, industry, NGOs, international institutions, and communities. And we tie into 3 global science programs. One is UNESCO's International Hydrological Program. The other is the World Climate Research Program, the GWEX, which is the Global Energy and Water Exchanges Project. And then Future Earth, which is a newer program which integrates human and physical changes to the environment with the biological changes. And they have a water futures component that we contribute to for Canada. We've managed to get 185 million to these projects and core teams over the first 3 years. So this is a massive acceleration of research capacity in Canada resulting from this. We were able to dispense 23.5 million to the projects and almost 15 million to operate the core teams. The projects have been able to leverage almost 27 million as cash, and almost 120 million is in-kind support. So there's a lot going on here. And I'm just going to zoom in on a few projects and you'll see what's happening. And a little more detail on some of these projects. 21 of the projects deal with pillars 1 and 2, anywhere from atmospheric science to water quality, water management, computing, crowdsourcing. 12 of the projects contribute to pillar 3, the user-led aspects. And these can be regional, such as the Prairie project I'll talk about. They can be sectoral, as agriculture, or topical, such as modeling and prediction. And all 3 of these are relevant to prairie wetlands here. I mentioned the core teams that we have, and we have staffed up the observatories and started the predictions. And so we already have a flood forecasting system operating now for the Yukon Territory and a mountain snow forecasting system for the Bow River above Calgary. And we're developing new technologies, snow water equivalent sensors, drone-based sensors, including a hyperspectral sensor that will help us assess harmful algal blooms in water bodies, and new offices and labs in various parts of Canada. So lots going on. And one thing we're developing right now is an Indigenous communities water strategy to focus on source water protection, climate change impacts, upstream water impacts, water rights and governance for those communities. And we see that as a very important component of global water futures. So what are the projects that contribute something to prairie wetlands? Oh, there are many that will contribute some aspects, so these 5 contribute substantially to it. The Prairie Water is based at the University of Saskatchewan, led by Chris Spence and Paul Whitfield. I'll go into that in a bit. The Diagnosing Governance of Agricultural Water Management by Philip Loring, based at U of S. Form Bloom, dealing with harmful algal blooms by Helen Balk, and Integrated Modeling and Prediction Program for Canada, led by Simon Rezavi. We also have a large prairie component to the Agricultural Water Futures Project, led by Maren McCrae of the University of Waterloo. That's not dealing with wetlands directly, but with runoff from agricultural fields, whether it's quantity or quality, and so ties in strongly to the inputs to our wetlands. And then, as I mentioned, the core teams have lots of influence there. So Prairie Water, the Spence and Whitfield project, why have that? Well, over 5.5 million people in the prairie provinces, in the prairie region. That's 80% of Canada's agricultural land, intensive land use, and significant challenges because of eutrophication of lakes, wetland drainage, water availability and water quality, and the sustainability of groundwater, which tends to be used in farms and smaller communities. This project has suggested key outcomes, one being prediction of water availability and quality under different climate and land use scenarios in the prairies. The second, assessment of groundwater resources and management by linking surface to subsurface models. The third is understanding wetland services, vulnerability, and conservation. And the fourth is a multi-stakeholder process to mobilize science and governance models with communities to improve their resiliency. So there's lots about prairie water that's directly relevant to the interests of the Prairie PHJV. Those break down into 4 themes: hydrology, groundwater, wetlands, and governance. And you can see the scientists involved in these. There are many more graduate students and postdoctoral fellows being hired under this program to contribute to these areas. And some of the progress to date, beyond working on CRIM modeling and hiring people. An example is a classification of prairie catchments, really looking at their assembly of wetlands and their drainage characteristics, which will allow us to expand hydrological modeling, water quality modeling across that region. We've also, as I mentioned, added nitrogen and phosphorus to the cold region's hydrological model and are proposing new ways to operate large-scale hydrological models across that region. We've also coupled the cold region's hydrological model to an economic model to look at the benefits and disadvantages of drainage, and with an example on Smith Creek. Another project very relevant to this is Form Bloom, which is looking at harmful algal blooms, and led by Helen Balk here at U of S, with a contingent from across Canada. And of course, this impacts our wetlands, but our wetlands also drain into lakes, where we have severe drinking water problems. Buffalo Pound Lake in Saskatchewan is one that comes to mind as having exceptionally severe problems. But of course, Lake Winnipeg and even Lake Diefenbaker coming along on this very unpleasant pathway. The adaptation strategies being developed by Form Bloom include forecasts of harmful algal blooms and communicating risks and testing for it. The longer-term, medium-term strategies involve nutrient control for runoff into these water bodies, physical and chemical interventions, and altering treatment protocols and strategies for drinking water and the sources. Philip Loring is leading a project called Diagnosing Governance Effectiveness of Agricultural Water Management. And this has a very strong wetland component to it. He's looking at drainage and noting as an important adaptation strategy to climate change. Farmers are draining because their fields are flooded and they're trying to farm. But he notes it's a governance issue because there are differences in the upstream, downstream benefits and transmission of externalities across boundaries and borders. It's a focus of conflict amongst user groups and, of course, drives extensive hydrological change. So the objectives there are to develop new knowledge on how people govern agricultural water management. What creates conflict over this? How might we achieve consensus? How can we enhance collaboration? And then producing novel approaches to socio and hydrological modeling by linking these governance models with hydroclimate models for planning. So perhaps linking hydrological models to economic models, to water quality models, to behavioral models right down to the farm gate. Types of questions that he's asking is what social institutions allow for effective and equitable drainage management? How do these institutions and policies shape resilience and adaptability to change? To what extent do conflicts shape or undermine these institutions? And how can the variables and scenarios relating to policy for drainage management be coupled with the outcomes of hydrological models to better predict change? So that's a very relevant one to this committee, and he's put together a socio-ecological systems framework for looking at the human dimension of wetland drainage through there. So we expect a lot from that project. Then a big one that we also expect a lot from is the Integrated Modeling for Prediction and Management of Change in the Major River Basins of Canada, or IMPC. And this is linked to the core modeling teams of Global Water Futures. It's led by Simon Razavi. The core modeling teams are led by Dr. Al Piachinero, so they work together very tightly on here. And the research themes in this modeling range from atmospheric modeling, water quality modeling, river ice, floodplain, social modeling, water management, and so it's very broad. It's going from the physical system into the human system and decision-making under uncertainty. There's also a strong user engagement aspect to it. It's a large team of modelers from a variety of backgrounds, some engineering, some social science, some chemistry, some hydrology. So it's a very interesting team. And they've made great progress to date, started to work out the modeling strategies, data policies. The core modeling strategy has been worked out with this team, and that's been very, very helpful. So in terms of knowledge transfer, they have a very strong component with events, social media outreach materials, and a knowledge mobilization oversight committee that might include some people familiar to you. So and they're measuring the capability of knowledge exchange using some social science metrics. So that's kind of interesting work. Okay, some of the big challenges that they're seeing in the modeling is so far we failed before Global Water Futures. We failed to link important features of climate, hydrology, water quality, ecosystem, and water management together. So that's what we want to address. We've noticed the fragmentation in operations, management, and governance of water resources systems. Want to demonstrate how that might be better done. And current practices often assume the stationarity of hydrological systems, that probabilities of flows and designs haven't changed over time. It's not true at all. Things are changing dramatically, as Smith Creek showed. And so assuming that stationarity is dead, which is a very good assumption, then we can start to predict the future changes that we might see. We had an Inception meeting for the Global Water Futures Leadership Group in Waterloo, Ontario last month. And with 33 projects and these many core teams, you easily get up to a very large meeting of people leading projects or working intently on them. And so we had over 80 people at that meeting. And despite such a large group, because they're very, very talented people, they were able to come up with an inception statement for Global Water Futures, noting that we've identified the grand challenge, which is how can we best prepare for and manage water futures in the face of dramatically increased risks from changing climate, a developing economy, and changing society. We noted that we've initiated 33 projects dealing with water research needs, big data, decision support, sensors and user questions, and 6 core teams. These projects and teams have started to exchange best practices and have begun the research observations modeling and bringing in large numbers of people. And we're starting to engage with levels of government across Canada and other groups with special interest engaging with Indigenous communities and UN-based science organizations. So some of the next steps. We're having the finale of a previous project, the Changing Cold Regions project, which is a GWEX regional hydroclimate study in Western Canada, and the Howard Weider Symposium to celebrate Howard Weider's career, his life, and cry a bit at his retirement. And that will be over the 5th to 8th of March in Saskatoon. We're having a Indigenous Communities Water Research Workshop in April in Saskatoon as well at Wanuskewin. And we're hosting the 8th GWEX International Science Conference in Canmore, Alberta in May. Those are held every few years, and they're a very big deal. We expect 450 of the world's top water and climate scientists coming to Canada. We will have the inaugural Global Water Futures annual science meeting in Hamilton, Ontario, the 4th to 6th of June, and users are particularly welcome to attend that meeting and to present. And the call for abstracts and registration is coming out shortly. And we're helping to sponsor the International Conference on Water Security in Toronto later on in June. So lots going on in the next few months with Global Water Futures. And if you're in Saskatoon or Canmore, pop by and pay us a visit. We have hundreds of researchers now set up in the prairies working on water problems, and we're keen to hear of your concerns and see how much of that we can address over the next few years. The program runs to 2023. We hope to leave Canada's water unrecognizable when we're done, with new prediction capabilities, new scientific capabilities, and new ideas to help us better govern water in this country. And we can only do that with partnerships and with your help. So I look forward to talking to more of you over time. So there we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pomeroy. Does anybody have any questions? If so, please type them into the chat box and have Dr. Pomeroy address them.
Looks like a question is coming.
Yep.
I apologize for my voice. I'm coming off a cold and my throat started to shut down there for a bit.
Okay, the question is, what do you think the importance of nutrient management to address water quality issues on the prairies?
Oh, it's very important. We have excess nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, uh, which have been loading up our water bodies across the prairies, associated with algal blooms. This has changed over time, and the incidence of algal blooms has increased over time. Part of that is due to shifts in climate, the increase in summer runoff driven by rainfall, and the very wet period we've had over the last 10 years, which is associated with increased runoff. But there have also been changes in agricultural practices, whether it's fertilization practices, tillage practices, and then the other impact in there is the increase in the contributing area of watersheds through drainage of depressions or wetlands, and that increasing contributing area, even if nothing else changes, it itself can increase nutrient loading by an order of magnitude very easily. So we need to look at all this comprehensively. The producers want to keep their nutrients on the land, and we want to keep them out of water bodies for a variety of reasons. So this is something where the Agricultural Water Futures Project, the Prairie Project, and others are looking at various techniques that we might do this, and both through field work and through modeling.
Okay, another question here. Are there any applications of the CRMM model or any hydrological model in Alberta looking at climate change impacts?
Yes, we've used it's the Cold Regions Hydrological Model, CRHM. We've used that working with Alberta Environment to model the Smoky River Basin, which is a large basin where we model it, and that's used operationally for their flood forecasting there. We've also used it for climate change impacts in the mountains in the parts of the Upper Bow River Basin, and we've run climate scenarios through that. And we've run it over the Vermilion River Basin as well, where we've looked at wetland change, but not climate change impacts yet. So most of the climate change impact work has been in the mountains to this point. So we're interested in, and we'll be using it in the Prairie Water project to look at some of the climate implications as well.
Okay, we have one more question. At what scale will you be modeling the combined impact of wetland drainage and climate change in the prairies?
This will be at multiple scales. In some of our watershed models right now, we model down to the field size, and that's in South Tobacco Creek. We can't do that across the prairies at that scale, and so we're using basins which are still in the sub-kilometer resolution for land use characteristics, but we generalize the basin structure a little bit based on a basin classification. We're driving that with climate models that are downscaled to a 4-kilometer resolution using the WRF model in a pseudo-global warming mode. And so that's a very high resolution product, but also coarser resolution downscaled climate model products. We will choose a few basins to fully model in a very accurate way: Camrose Creek in Alberta, Smith Creek, St. Denis in Saskatchewan, and the Broughtons Creek in Manitoba, and South Tobacco. But to do the detailed modeling, we need LiDAR. We need LiDAR-based DEMs in order to figure out the drainage patterns and pathways, and And so the more of that that's available, the more we'll model in detail. Otherwise, we'll be using this virtual basin concept and clustered analyses as I showed in the map previously.
Oh, okay. There doesn't seem to be any more questions. Thank you, Dr. Pomeroy, for your very interesting presentation today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to send me an email and I can pass them along. Or I'm sure Dr. Pomeroy wouldn't mind getting a email at the address he has there on his final screen here. Again, thank you for everybody for attending, and we'll see you next month for our next webinar.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.